A number of anniversaries are coinciding this year. It's 40 years since the first death was reported from AIDS. It's 30 years since Freddie Mercury died from it. The World Health Organization estimates around 80 million people globally have been infected with HIV. 36 million have died. Tonight, ahead of World AIDS Day, we reflect with two people who were there from the start. In a moment, the Health Secretary in charge. But first, here's Steve's story. Steve was diagnosed with HIV in 1987. He thought he would have 5 years to live. 34 years on, he is alive. But the two men he has loved are not.
Stuart was the first Mr. Right. We met in '89. We both had HIV. Given medical knowledge at the time, we didn't know how long we had. It was enjoy it while you can. He died of aspergillosis pneumonia. It was a complication of HIV. I met John 5 or 6 months after Stuart died. I took one look at him and I knew he was Mr. Right number 2. John died in March 2007.
HIV and AIDS has robbed him of friends and partners. He doesn't need a day to remember. But he was there at the beginning to ensure that the rest of us do.
You went to what funerals you could. That's where the candlelight vigil came in. It was a grassroots concept that on the 1st of December we'd meet in Trafalgar Square just after dusk. And we'd remember all the people who died that year. The funerals you couldn't go to.
A lot has changed since the government campaigns of the 1980s. There's now effective treatment, but it's estimated up to 18% of people in Wales with HIV still don't know they have it. How important is it, perhaps this year than others, that we remember?
It's something we should never forget. For me personally, on my cover page at Facebook, I have the slogan, "Every day is World AIDS Day."
Vital we record stories like Steve's. Well, Norman Fowler was the Health Secretary at the time in Margaret Thatcher's cabinet. He's been widely credited, recognising the issue of HIV/AIDS early on and his continuing work in the area. Earlier this year, he stepped away from the speakership of the House of Lords to focus on it. I spoke to him about his memories. Can you tell us what it was like to try and change the mindset in Whitehall and in Downing Street in those early days?
Well, and generally in the public. I mean, although homosexuality had been legalised, there was still a vast amount of prejudice against it, and that's what we had to battle with. And when it came to the kind of campaign that we were going to do, then we had all kinds of alternatives put to us, like put people into isolation, whole groups of people into isolation for life. I mean, there were some incredible things that took place. Our view was, my view was, that this was basically a public health issue. It should be dealt with like any other public health issue. But given that in this case we had no cure, no vaccine, and there weren't many alternatives on what you did in those circumstances.
I mean, given the parallels of what we're living through now, do you perhaps in your quieter moment think, if only we had a fraction of the attention that coronavirus has had in recent years, it could have made so much more difference?
Well, I'm not entirely sure about that, because what we did was we had a mass campaign, a mass television campaign it came to in the end. And by the end, we did a follow-up survey, and it showed that something like 96% of the public then knew about HIV and AIDS. Now, whether that continued to be the case, I'm not quite so sure. But certainly in at the peak of it, 1986-87, I think that the public were entirely engaged. And although not everyone followed our advice, a vast numbers did. Deaths came down, HIV came down, and actually other sexual not offences, conditions came down. So I think that that was its justification. It was a Don't Die of Ignorance campaign, and it had impact.
How important is it? Because this year there's a lot of anniversaries tied into this World AIDS Day. How important is it that we remember the 1980s and the 90s, and indeed now, and that we document it, capture those stories?
I think it is important that we do that, and I think it's important that we think about the lessons and the findings. I mean, one of the things that still continues is the stigma of HIV, and we need to fight against that. And we haven't remotely got rid of that. And people with HIV are still discriminated against, and that in many ways is one of our worst problems. We have a better position, thank goodness, now in Britain, but if you go to other parts of the world, you find some very dire situations. And of course, you find situations where the whole thing, homosexuality is regarded as a criminal offence, and of course if you do that, then the chances of running a kind of successful campaign are zero. And you can find that not only in Africa but in countries like Russia, which has a terrible record. They keep on ignoring all the evidence that comes up and do very little about it, I'm afraid. So there's a lot to be done yet.
And is that why you said when you retired from the Speakership of the House of Lords earlier this year that you were going to devote the rest of your career to this issue? This is why it's so important to you?
Yes, it is really, and I don't think I've really succeeded yet. It's taken me longer than I expected to get back into the run of things, but I still regard it, for me personally, as the number one political issue and human issue that there is. I think I can probably make a contribution there. Not least in explaining what happened in the 1980s, but also in explaining or trying to explain what the challenges are now. We've come a long way, but we've still got a long way to go. And I'm afraid, testing, for example, in many parts of the world has fallen off because of the COVID crisis. And it's about 40% down, I think, in many places to what it was. So there's a long, long way to go, but we are at least making progress now, and perhaps at some stage we will get a cure, at some stage we will get vaccination, I don't know. But at the moment, at any rate, we're in a much better position than we were when I was Health Secretary.